Good evening. Sure is good to see everyone this evening. We did not blow away in the intervening time, it seems. In Acts, we have an interesting story. Again, as always, when I say that, I'm not implying it's fiction. But it's a story told to us of Peter. And ultimately, it's pretty much the last story we're told of Peter. We have, of course, Peter's letters that he writes that may have taken place after these events, but this is the last time we really spend any time with Peter as Luke transitions to his focus on Paul for the rest of the book of Acts. In this story, we have Peter being a target of the persecution in the Jerusalem, Judea area against Christians. Herod has noticed, I guess you could say, that he has a political benefit or has something politically to gain from persecuting the Christians because they are becoming increasingly unpopular among the Jews. And so as a result, he says, well, let me win myself a little bit of popularity among the people that I rule because, that comes in short supply, especially for someone like Herod. And so he begins persecuting the church. He executes one of the leading apostles, the Apostle James, and he puts Peter in prison to be brought out and potentially to be executed as well. So Peter is in prison, and of course, he doesn't know exactly what's going to happen. And as the story is told, all of a sudden we have this kind of strange thing that happens to Peter, and it's kind of told from his perspective, so we're following along with his emotions. We see him being kind of confused as this angelic figure appears to him, and he thinks he's probably dreaming, or maybe this is a vision that God is giving him, and the door to his prison cell is open, and the door to the prison itself is open. The guards are asleep, and so, okay, what does this vision mean, right? And so he walks out into the courtyard, and finally they open, the angel that is, opens the last gate and leaves. And Peter's like, hold on, let me pinch myself, right? This isn't a dream. And so he's been set free through God's own hand by the providence of an angel. And so, naturally, he goes to his Christian family. He finds the household of one of his Christian brethren, and he knocks on the door, or rings the bell, or however they did at that time. And someone answers the door. Naturally, in this kind of society, for those who were well-to-do, you would have a servant, or what we would call a slave, answer the door. That was part of the job. And so one of the household slaves opens the door. Except they don't actually open the door. They ask who it is. Kind of like, if someone knocks on the door at a late hour of the night, you might not actually open the door right away. You might use the peephole or something, right? And try and be like, who is this? And Peter says, it's me, open the door. And the servant girl, she's excited. Not just excited, she is overjoyed. And she runs back. It's very comical. She doesn't open the door for Peter, who she's overjoyed to hear out of prison. She runs back to everyone in the house who happens to be praying for Peter. And she says, Peter's here. And of course, they don't believe her. And she keeps on insisting, no, I just heard Peter. And they're like, well, maybe it's his ghost or something like that. Maybe he's died in his prison cell. And then, of course, they finally open the door and Peter walks in and he's able to spend time with his Christian family. The story is focused on Peter, don't get me wrong. But tonight I want us to talk just a little bit about the slave girl. Only 2 verses that have anything in the entirety of Scripture to do with this slave girl, but it's there for a reason, just like everything else in Scripture. Her name's Rhoda, we're told. And all we're told is this one short little interaction with Peter. But it tells us something, I think. So let's look at what it tells us. First of all, let's ask the question, who was Rhoda? We mentioned that she was a servant girl or a slave girl, depending on how we would describe that. I want us to kind of get a picture of what that meant in their society. We talked a little bit about this in different contexts, but I want us to get a little bit of picture. And I think the best way to do that is to see where this same word is used in other passages of Scripture. Same word used for the slave or servant girl is used also in Peter's denial. Interesting that it has to do with Peter and a slave girl. I wonder if there's a little bit of foreshadowing there in just a very minor sense. Peter is in the courtyard, waiting to hear of what's going to happen with Jesus after he's been taken prisoner, has been arrested. And Peter's in this courtyard, and one of the slave girls, same exact word used, of the high priest, she is there in the courtyard. Naturally, because she's a servant of the high priest, this is the courtyard of the high priest's residence, so she's going to be around doing her duties, probably helping to keep the fire warm, helping to provide maybe drinks or whatever for the soldiers that are warming themselves by the fire. And the servant girl sees him and begins to tell everyone, hey, this man is one of the servants of, or rather disciples of, this individual who's just been arrested. Now, why would this girl do that? Well, if you are a servant, a slave, don't you want your master to like you? Kind of like we talked about this morning with Joseph. She's probably trying to get a little bit of a better situation for herself, because after all, she is, when all is said and done, a slave. We see in Acts later on a different account that we're given. As this is Luke and Paul and whoever's with him, as we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners much gain by fortune telling. This is not someone who has volunteered to be a fortune teller on either front. She didn't ask for the spirit of divination. We're not going to go into all the details of what that is, but she didn't ask for that to be inhabiting her. She also didn't ask for her masters to be using her in this regard. She doesn't have a choice in whether or not she's going to be put in this position. She is just doing what her masters want her to do because they're making money off of her. That's just how this works. We also see in Galatians, as we were referring back to the account of Abraham with his wives, Sarah and Hagar, it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free. Same word in all of these different instances. We're talking about someone who doesn't have much choice in their life, doesn't have much ability to better themselves, and certainly on every possible level is at the bottom of the social totem pole. Doesn't really have any agency, doesn't really have any options in life, just invisible for all human perceptions at least. She is someone no one would have noticed. She was just a slave girl who would have been invisible to the world. And yet, as we mentioned, it's already interesting that she's mentioned by name in the scriptures. In fact, that's not very uncommon, is it, for seemingly insignificant people to be mentioned by name in the scriptures? She's invisible, but she's not invisible to God as he's inspiring his word, but it doesn't seem like she's invisible to Peter either. Let's keep on going, because this is what I think is the most interesting about this entire story. Why was she so excited? Why did she care so much about Peter being released from prison? Who is Peter friends with? Well, Peter is ultimately friends with her masters, right? He has a relationship with the people she serves. At least that would be the assumption. Why does she care so much? Well, the short answer is we're not exactly sure, are we? We're not told exactly why she cares. But there's several reasons that are possible, and whichever one it is, I think maybe there's a couple that I would lean toward more than anything, but whichever one it is, it says something about her, and it says something about Peter. It's possible, on one hand, that she is excited because she herself has been converted to Christ. We know that many slaves, even in the early days of the church, were some of the first ones to respond to the gospel. It's possible she was one of those. It's possible then that because she was a Christian and because she understood how much Peter had been doing for the cause of Christ, possibly even being the one who was instrumental in converting her, that she is overjoyed because he has now been released, and she has a personal stake in him accomplishing his work, just as he did, rather, among her and her masters. That's one possibility. It's also possible, although this isn't the stance that most people take, but it's also possible she's not a Christian. It does seem that she is kind of included in that number, but we're not sure. We're not told explicitly. But even then, I think this tells us something about Peter. Why would a slave girl, for the sake of argument, if she's not a Christian, why would she still be excited for Peter to be there? Well, I want us to think about who Peter is for just a moment. Like I say, I probably lean toward the former explanation that she probably has been converted either by Peter or by those that Peter converted in her household who were her masters. But either way, even if she is a convert, in any other situation, in any other social setting, you wouldn't think that anyone would notice her, would pay attention to her. But think about who Peter is. Specifically, who Peter has been taught by. Remember when Jesus is eating and drinking? He is eating and drinking, having fellowship in a broad sense with the rich and the powerful of his day. Oh wait, no, that's not what Jesus did, is it? Oh yeah, every once in a while he went and had a meal with a Pharisee or something like that when he was invited, but that wasn't his normal practice. No, normally he ate with the tax collectors and the sinners. The ones who were low on the totem pole, the ones who no one wanted to associate with, the ones who, for all intents and purposes, were either invisible or people tried to pretend they were invisible because they didn't want anything to do with them. And so at a certain point, as he begins to show that this is his practice, the ones who are a little bit higher on the totem pole say, what is he doing? Why would he be hanging around these types of people? And yes, that is how they would have said it. And Jesus responds by saying, those who are well don't need a physician. It's those who are sick. If you're perfectly healthy, do you go to the doctor? Why would you spend the $30 or whatever your copay is, right? That is a waste of time. It's a waste of money. You go to the doctor when you're sick. Or at this time, and even not too long ago in our own history as a country, a society, a lot of times the doctor would come to you. Well, the doctor's not going to come to you if you say, hey, doc, I'm doing really good. I'm very healthy. I don't need anything. Okay, I'll be right over. That's not how it works. That's silly. That's intentional that Jesus is making them feel a little silly here. Just to prove the point. And Peter was there for that. Peter witnessed this interaction. He also witnessed it later on in Jesus' ministry, whenever Jesus did something even more radical. You want to talk about someone in the position of a slave. It was the slave, in fact, the lower level slave, not one of the slaves who maybe handled some of the finances of the household, like, for example, Joseph did, as we talked about this morning. Like someone who had a kind of a skill, and so they were, I hate to use this term, but a skill slave kind of thing, more than just a unskilled laborer, if you will. No, this would have been the lower level slaves who would have washed feet. It was a very humble, a very humbling task to be given. No one gave it to Jesus. He volunteered. One by one, washing the disciples' feet. And you remember Peter? Peter, when Jesus approaches to wash his feet, no, Lord, I'm not going to let you do this. I'm not going to let you demean yourself before me to wash my feet. Jesus says, oh, if you don't let me wash your feet, you don't belong with me. Oh, wash everything. Give me a bath, essentially. Wash my hands and my head, right? Once again, Peter is present for this. He doesn't get it, I would argue, the first time when he sees Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners. He doesn't understand what's going on, but he sees Jesus' response. He doesn't understand what's going on when Jesus washes his feet, but he sees Jesus' response. That's the kind of example that Peter had. Well, there we go. And whenever Peter was the one who denies Jesus 3 times, and Jesus eventually rises from the dead, and Peter is there, they have this conversation. Peter, who has witnessed all these things, hasn't gotten it and has, metaphorically, stabbed his Lord in the back. He is asked, "Do you love me, Peter?" He's asked 3 times. And Peter's upset because he's asked this. And he says, "You know I love you." And each time, Jesus says some variation of, "Feed my sheep." You realize what he's telling Peter? He's telling Peter, I want you to take care of those I've been ministering to when I'm gone. I want you to take up the mantle. I want you to follow in my footsteps. Yes, you who has stabbed me in the back. I want you to do this for me. So no, we don't know exactly what Peter and Rhoda's relationship was. But I think it's a pretty good guess that while everyone else may have ignored Rhoda, Peter didn't. While everyone else might have not even seen her, might have regarded her as just the invisible help, he saw her as a soul that needed Christ, just like everyone else. So yeah, Rhoda was overjoyed. Even if maybe she didn't know much about the gospel, although it seems she probably did, here was someone who not only was a friend of her master's, but most likely saw her too. After all, we see among the early church this very intense practice of fellowship. We see the kind of people the early church were. We see the care they had for one another. People from all walks of life. Remember, Peter's not a whole lot higher on the totem pole either, is he? He's just a fisherman. So we have, ultimately, an example not only of Rhoda and the kind of attitude she has, but we have a statement about Peter's character as well. We know that Peter meant a lot to Rhoda's masters, to everyone who was gathered there at the house. But obviously, he meant something to Rhoda personally. This isn't I'm excited for my masters, I'm going to go and tell them. That's not the depth of the word that is used here, I would argue. She is joyful. Not for the sake of others, but for herself. And the fact that she had that kind of regard for Peter, as a slave who normally wouldn't be seen by anyone, and yet she thinks this much of Peter, that says something not just about her, that says something about him and how he acted around her, and most likely how he acted towards her as well. So why do we bring all this up? Because I think there's something this can teach us. Even though, again, the main focus of this account is on Peter and his deliverance from prison and God's providence and all that, I still think we can learn something just from those 2 little verses where Rhoda is mentioned. My brothers, this is James speaking. Show no partiality as you hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. Then he goes into this hypothetical, although it wasn't really a hypothetical. It was just a thing that happened in different situations and in different exact circumstances, but it happened. And it still happens. Man comes into the assembly of the Lord's church wearing fine clothing, gold rings, and everyone's like, oh, we want to make a good impression on him. Maybe he'll stick around. Maybe he'll put a big old check in the collection plate. And then someone comes in, doesn't look like much, isn't dressed in their Sunday best, as we call it. It doesn't really seem like they have cultured manners. Not they're rude, but just they're not. They're of a different social class than we are. And I know we say we don't have social classes in America, but we do. How would we respond to each one? I can tell you how many Christians, very sadly, have responded, even in the modern day. There are still plenty of congregations where you can hear stories about people who have been very unsubtly told, I don't think you're a good fit for this congregation. It's not because of their beliefs. It's not because of any moral failing on their part. It's not because they've been mean or cruel to people at the congregation. It's because they just don't belong to the social class of the congregation. That happens more than we want to admit. Sometimes it's based on social class. Sometimes it's based on wealth. Sometimes it's based on race. Sometimes it's based on any number of things. But it happens. And James says it shouldn't. For Rhoda, it seems it didn't. Certainly in Jesus' ministry it didn't. But it shouldn't for us either. Now, I'm not saying that I've seen an example of that among us. I think that we are generally good at welcoming people. And that brings me joy to see that. But it is a reminder we all need, not just when we're together, but individually as well. It reminds me also, another account where Peter is kind of the center stage. If you remember, Peter is called to go help some Christians who have just lost a dear sister. In some translations, she is named Tabitha, and some she is named Dorcas, but in either case, this woman is a woman who has made a huge impact on that church. And although in our story with Rhoda, Peter is the one who has made this huge impact, I would argue Peter's not the focus once he gets to this location. Everyone doesn't say, oh, it's Peter, it's Peter. No, everyone says, our sister's gone. Look at what she did for me. Look at this garment, this tunic that she made for me to keep me from the cold, because I couldn't afford one of my own. Look at the impact she had on all of us. And of course, Peter, because at this point in time, he has the opportunity and the power to confirm his message, to demonstrate the power of God among the early church, he raises her from the dead. And oh, the joy of the people there. Why? Widows weren't much better in their society than the slave girls. They didn't have anyone to stand up for them. They had very few rights. They often were in great peril of their lives because they didn't have any kind of way to provide for themselves in most situations. And yet this woman, Dorcas, she saw them too. This should bring us back to what Jesus says to his disciples as he is describing what will happen at the end of time. Not in terms of the end of the world specifically and all the different theories that people come up with about that. No, he's describing what will happen when we stand before him at judgment. He divides those who are before him, he divides them into two groups. One who will be separated from him, one who will be granted fellowship with him. And you remember what he says to those who are given fellowship? He says, you gave me water to drink. You gave me food to eat. You visited me when I was sick, when I was in prison. Ministered to my needs. Now he's talking in grand terms here. He's not just talking to people who saw him. He's talking in this end situation where everyone there who is gathered because they're faithful to him, of all generations, of all times. Well, I never got to give Jesus a glass of water. I never got to visit him while he was being held as a prisoner before his execution. And so those who are standing there, they say, when did we do that? Not that we wouldn't have. We would have loved the opportunity to do that, but when did we do that? Jesus says, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. When we help someone who's invisible to the world, when we see someone who no one else sees, when we get out of our comfort zone, out of our bubble, to be Jesus, if we want to put it that way, in someone else's life, we're doing it to him. We're helping him. We're ministering to him. Of course, the opposite is true. That's the darker side of the statement of Jesus. The ones who refuse, whether it's because of prejudice, whether it's because of inconvenience, whatever the reason, the ones who refuse, well, they refused it to Jesus. But I think we see in the response of Rhoda, in our short little passage tonight, we see what that can look like. We see the impact that that can have. Presumably, Rhoda wasn't mistreated. After all, her masters were Christians. But this man who had become something meaningful, someone important to her masters, had become something important, someone important to her as well. And I would venture to guess it's because he himself followed the advice and the example of his master. So what can we learn from this account? No one is beneath me. I should treasure the positive influence I can have on everyone I meet. I think about individuals that I have met or heard of who go to third world countries and help people in those situations, especially the people who are from the third world country and they do ministry work in that country, sometimes even after coming to the States. And yet they want to serve those who are suffering, who are hurting, who are the lesser thans, at least as the world would qualify them. No one is beneath me. And if I am willing to have an influence, to be intentional, I'm never going to realize fully just how much of an influence, just how much of an impact I'm capable of having. That doesn't mean I'm not having it. Rhoda reminds us that we have unique opportunities to touch one another's lives for the better. I'm sure Peter, theorizing of course, but I'm sure Peter probably chuckled with the others once he was finally let in the door, that Rhoda just left him standing there out in the cold for a minute. But I imagine it also meant something to him. That the slave girl was so touched, was so overjoyed, that she forgot even to do her job, open the door, in her excitement. It's those small moments like that. Speaking as someone who is blessed to do ministry work, it's those small little moments where you realize you've just had a little bit of an impact in someone's life. Those are some of the most treasured memories. Just those little insights. Oh, I actually did accomplish something in this person's life. Not that it's about me, it's about God, but we don't always get those moments. But if we're intentional about reaching people, helping people, meeting needs, those moments are happening whether we see them or not. And that's what we're working towards. Ministering like Jesus, like Peter, like the apostles in the early church, because that's the privilege that we have as being Christians. If there's anything we can do for you tonight, Please let us know as we stand and as we sing together.
There's a great day coming.
A great day.